Here you go!
Optic blast!
X-Men versus Street Fighter!
Throughout the 80s, Capcom was at the forefront of the latest gaming trends. They knew how to make addictive arcade experiences, as well as high-quality console games, especially those based on licensed properties. With hit after hit, Capcom was widely regarded as a top-tier video game developer. However, their initial foray into the fighting game genre, with the first Street Fighter, was nowhere near as successful as its successor. Capcom, however, was inspired to continue developing fighting games with the international success of their arcade brawler, Final Fight. In 1991, they released Street Fighter II for the first time in Japan. Street Fighter II would end up being their most popular and most financially successful game, an achievement that would not be matched until the release of Resident Evil 5 in 2009, 18 years later. At around the same time, Fox Kids was making its mark on broadcast television. Fox Kids was a programming block for children in the 90s, developed in response to the rising popularity of the Disney Afternoon block. Part of what helped Fox Kids distinguish itself from Disney Afternoon was their shows based on superhero properties. In the fall of 1992, Fox Kids premiered new superhero cartoons, Batman the Animated Series, and X-Men. Marvel Productions had attempted to produce an X-Men series with a pilot titled Pride of the X-Men. The pilot premiered sporadically on syndicated channels in 1989, but the pilot did not lead to a full-fledged series. One of the pilot's executive producers, Margaret Loesch, became the CEO of Fox Kids in 1990, and one of the shows she arranged for the block was a new X-Men series.
Dan and I would have long discussions when I was at Marvel about his favorite characters, and I remember going into him one day and asking him, I mean, obviously Spider-Man is his favorite, but he talked a lot about X-Men because he loved X-Men. And one day I was talking to him and he was saying, he didn't say these words, but it added up to the way I took it. I said, I get it. It's about disenfranchised teens. He said, well, I've never quite thought of it that way, but yes, it's kids who are different.
While X-Men and Batman helped revitalize interest in superhero comics, Street Fighter II and all its revisions would help revitalize interest in arcades and the fighting game genre as a whole. At this point in the 90s, it would seem almost unfathomable that these two entities would intertwine as one singular property.
You made them the most popular comic book in the world. You voted their television premiere your favorite Fox Kids show. Now, those amazing Mighty Mutants are back in one incredible hour that'll knock you out.
Surrender, mutant.
Of course not.
This one is for you.
Watch the series premiere of X-Men next Saturday morning on Fox.
X-Men proved to be a hit for Fox Kids, so what started as a 13-episode order became a 5-season series lasting from 1992 to 1997. X-Men would become one of Fox Kids' main staples, one that would make it easy for television producer Haim Saban to pitch another show to CEO Margaret Loesch that would also help define Fox Kids: Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the Western adaptation of Kyoryu's Sentai Zyuranger. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers would be the beginning of the long-running tradition of producing westernized versions of annual Super Sentai shows from Japan, and Saban credits the popularity of X-Men for making Mighty Morphin Power Rangers a possibility for Fox Kids. Street Fighter II, on the other hand, would see multiple enhancements to help increase its popularity while improving and updating the game itself. Their most notable revision came in 1993 with Super Street Fighter II, the game that would become Capcom's first game developed for their CP System 2 hardware. The CPS-2 would end up being used to develop a large portion of Capcom's arcade titles from the 90s, as well as a few released in the early 2000s. Around the time of Super Street Fighter II's original release, Street Fighter II was starting to branch out into more forms of entertainment. Action figures, a live-action movie by die-hard director Stephen E. D'Souza,
Now, who wants to go home and who wants to go with me?
an anime movie and series both directed by Night on the Galactic Railroad director Gisaburo Sugi, and a Western cartoon by Invision Entertainment for the USA Network. Also at the height of the X-Men cartoon and Street Fighter's popularity, Capcom released a new 2D fighting game based on X-Men for their CPS-2 hardware, X-Men Children of the Atom. While this was not Capcom's first game based on a Marvel property, nor was it the first X-Men video game, it was Capcom's first CPS-2 fighting game to feature Marvel characters. Children of the Atom was loosely based on X-Men's Fatal Attractions comic, which had also been an inspiration for Season 4 of the X-Men cartoon. The following year in 1995, both the Street Fighter and the X-Men property would receive new releases. First, Street Fighter Alpha, a prequel to the entire Street Fighter series, and a few months later, Marvel Superheroes, which had only featured 4 X-Men characters: Wolverine, Psylocke, Magneto, and Juggernaut. 1 year later, Capcom's most popular fighting game franchise and Marvel's most popular team of superheroes at the time would collide in the wildest crossover you have never dreamed. In September 1996, X-Men vs. Street Fighter was released for the CPS2 arcade in Japan. Like Capcom's recent CPS2 fighters, The attention to detail in the sprite animation was highly praised, with the gameplay incorporating tag team 2-on-2 style fighting, with the ability to switch characters on the spot. The roster consisted of half X-Men characters and half Street Fighter characters. Some of the X-Men characters were previously introduced in X-Men Children of the Atom, but X-Men characters Gambit, Storm, and Sabretooth made their Capcom debut with this game. X-Men villain Apocalypse served as the game's boss character. While this would be Apocalypse's first appearance in a CPS2 fighter, his first appearance in a Capcom game was the Super Nintendo X-Men Mutant Apocalypse. It was not the first crossover fighting game, it certainly wasn't the first crossover game, but it was arguably one of the most popular and most accessible crossovers at the time. The game would be released a year later on the Sega Saturn, and then a few months later on the PlayStation. Like console ports of CPS2 games at the time, the Saturn version was the more critically acclaimed port, while the PlayStation version was the more critically panned port. In 1997, the sequel, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, was released. This time, some of the X-Men characters were swapped with superheroes and villains from other Marvel properties, with some of the Street Fighter representatives shuffled around. And when that game became a success, Marvel vs. Capcom was released, featuring more Marvel characters and going beyond Street Fighter, featuring other Capcom characters who in their own right would be capable of holding their own in a fighting game. The Marvel vs. Capcom games would become one of Capcom's most popular fighting franchises, on par with what they had achieved with the Street Fighter series, with each new Marvel vs. Capcom game being built for the latest systems instead of relying on the same one over and over, and adding more representatives from Marvel and Capcom respectively. The Marvel-Capcom crossover did inspire other crossover fighters, SNK vs. Capcom, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, and Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Still notable in their own rights, they could not achieve the fame, popularity, and legacy of the Marvel vs. Capcom games, all of which started when Cyclops and Ryu shook hands in the opening intro of X-Men vs. Street Fighter, the official beginning of the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise. X-Men, a franchise that inspired a cartoon that would set the standard for kids programming in the 90s. Street Fighter, a franchise that raised the bar for fighting games and arcade experiences. Bring them both together, and you get a one-of-a-kind series that pushed boundaries for what was possible in fighting games.